Hello, everyone. Welcome to the RMIT Cyber Series, organized by the RMIT Center for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation. Before introducing our host and also our speaker today, let me acknowledge the country. We would like to acknowledge the people of the Waigurang and Wunwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded lands we conduct the business of RMIT University and the lands that I'm speaking from today. As we gather virtually across many different parts of the world, we also encourage you to acknowledge the lands in which you are joining us from. We respectfully acknowledge the First Nation people of the 5 Kulin nations, their ancestors and elders, past, present, and emerging. RMIT Center for Cybersecurity Research and Innovation was established in 2020. We carry out quality multidisciplinary research related to organizational, human, and technology aspect of cybersecurity. We aim to develop and promote understanding of strategies, policies, and law issues of the cybersecurity challenges for Australia. So today's host will be Zahir Tari, the research director of our center. So Zahir, all to you.
Thank you, Hong. Thank you. I'm standing a little bit, and I would really thank you, Hong. And as Hong said, this is part of the RMIT Research Seminar Series. They are internal, but we have also people from outside. And the aim really from the center perspective is to bring people together from mathematics, from computer science, from engineering, from business. So it's really a great opportunity to have you, Craig, here. Before I introduce you, I would like first to thank Hong and Shabnam for organizing these great seminars. Thank you, Hong. You are doing a great job with Shabnam. It's really great. We have other type of talks with keynotes and so on, but this one is really the technical ones, and we want to get people from different areas. Like we have people from math, we have Joanne. I can see Joanne is here, and people from a different. It's great. Thank you very much, Hong and Shabnam. So now I would like to quickly, because it's not about me, it's about Craig. And when I see Craig, I couldn't recognize him with a beard. Craig used to be a young man. He used to be without short hair, no beard. As he said, it's probably the COVID. And Craig is really he's making us proud. I know he has a great position. Of course, we acknowledge that. But I think that the good thing is Craig, he is also making us proud in sense. He is our student as well. He started in 2000. I think he went through our undergrad program. He went through our honors and PhD, right? So he has been really for quite a long time at RMIT. So he's connected to RMIT. And it's really, you made us proud, Craig, when we see you, especially for our students who are doing PhD and so on, who are doing undergrad, when they see you successful, it's really a good role model. And we're really, hopefully, we can keep in touch as well, and really working together and so on and so on. So quickly about Craig, I think you have seen the bio. I don't need to add more. I mean, he is a principal security engineer. He has extensive experience in the area of security. His PhD is on security rights with Peter Bartok, I think, as a supervisor. And he worked in different teams, and he worked in Australia, and as he said, he worked in the UK as well. And he has been a subject expert in CompTIA and participated to a number of workshops and committees, security committees, and so on. I mean, you can see his bio, but more importantly, of course, he enjoys his family, as he said. He likes his family, but also he likes Collingwood, right? You are a Collingwood fan, right?
That's true.
But I think they didn't make it, right? I don't know. I mean, probably you can talk to Matt, because Matt is a supporter of Geelong, right? Geelong and yeah. So anyway, thank you very much, Craig. And it's great honors to have you here. And so I will stop talking, and now it's to you, Craig. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Thank you, Zahir.
I'll stop sharing my screen, and Craig, you can start sharing your screen.
All right, great. Thank you for the kind words and the offer to present. Let's see, I'll make sure I get the right screen. I'll try that one more time. And in terms of the PhD, I've still got some unfinished business there. I postponed after about 18 months, but I started at RMIT back in 2000. And I remember James Harland, Mathematics for Computer Science, Ron Van Schindel, the Computational Science course, and Peter Bertok. I took his Network Security course as an undergrad, and Zahir, a lot of influence from you when it came to security for distributed systems. So got you all to a lot of thanks and so much gratitude for really instilling that passion in me. So I just want to make sure.
And
Am I
Craig,
showing?
your supervisor still waiting for you.
Excellent. Well, I've definitely got some unfinished business. So
Don't remind him. Don't remind him.
now, is my PowerPoint showing? Let me know.
Yes.
I can see the
Excellent.
PowerPoint. Yeah.
Okay. And did you just see a slide transition then?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah. Excellent. Cool.
Craig,
We're in
Craig,
good shape.
you would also ask people to ask you questions. They can ask you questions, right?
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Just unmute, jump in, and ask questions along the way. We'll make this as interactive as possible. I much prefer it that way. So we're here to talk about.
Sorry, could you please full screen your slides?
Yep, I should be able to do that. Won't be a moment.
Awesome, thank you.
Excellent. Okay, cool. I just want to. Actually, if I do that, I've lost my speaker notes. That's the only problem. How impactful is it if I just have it like that?
Not much different.
That's fine. I think people can still see
Yeah.
this.
For people who are old like me, I cannot see where. I'm joking. I can see.
Excellent. Cool. All right. So we're here to talk about threat modeling for software builders, so developers who aren't necessarily security practitioners. I've been threat modeling since about 2005, 2006, and threat modeling as a discipline, that's actually my first question to you folks. Like I've called out some significant types of security events over the last 90 or so years. Threat modeling isn't necessarily an old approach because when we think about computer attacks, they were physical, then they became network based, and then they became more and more software based. So to kick things off, I want to do a bit of a level setter, and I want to see someone who's in the audience. Which decade do you think threat modeling became a common thing to perform? And it's fine if you don't know because I haven't actually defined threat modeling yet.
Ron,
But any
you have an
guesses?
answer, Ron?
I think in the Cold War.
Yeah. What about software-based threat modeling?
I think might be 90s, probably. Who knows? Might be 90s.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
90s, 80s, maybe 80s or 90s.
It's actually early 2000s. So events like SQL Slammer, NIMDA, Code Red, those types of internet worms, just as e-commerce was becoming a more common thing, that's when there was an edict from Bill Gates actually, and he decided we've got to do more when it comes to software security. So the SDL was formed, known as the Security Development Lifecycle, and that was an overlay of security activities to do as part of the software development lifecycle. So around about 2002, 2003, that's when the Trustworthy Computing Manifesto came out of Microsoft. And a lot of the threat modeling approaches that a lot of companies use is very heavily based on what Microsoft produced right around 2002, 2003. Obviously, iterations to make things more suitable to whether software teams are using waterfall or agile or other types of methodologies. But the concepts behind threat modeling, that's when it came about, and that's what I'm going to cover here. So let's move on. So why do we threat model? What we find is by just developing based on software requirements, even when we do our best to come up with security requirements, things often get missed. Then they get developed, get delivered. we've got real world customers using these services, and then a security defect comes about. And it's so much more expensive to fix something that's already in production versus fixing it as closely to the point of when it is introduced. So we're trying to move leftwards with as many security activities as possible. And threat modeling is a great design time activity to think critically about a overall service design and detect complete paths of badness and basically avoid those. So it's a design time activity in the SDLC process. And the good thing about threat modeling is, like I mentioned a moment ago, you don't need to be a security professional to perform threat modeling. Basically just need to think critically about your system or service and think what could go wrong. And it's really trying to violate assumptions and thinking about silly things, the whole what if, turning something upside down, inverting the happy path into an unhappy path. It's that type of thinking which is used to threat model. But everything I've said so far is more of an art form. And then when we look at the modeling approach, which is a little bit more scientific, that can sometimes become too academic. So to work the best, and this is the point of this discussion, is what works for software builders is to having engineering rigor around a process to perform threat modeling. So that's really that happy path, so that we've got something that becomes repeatable and consistent, but also practical for a software engineer to be able to use. And the other, I guess, tip of the trade that it's taken me some years to discover is it's really hard to bring software developers to where I am. If I've got a tool or a process or a mechanism of sorts, it's friction for me to bring a developer to where I am. I need to be where the developer is, so I need to be able to embed my tool or process or mechanism into the developer's pipeline, and then it's a lot less friction. We become an enabler at that point as opposed to a blocker. So that's really the key behind being able to have threat modeling done successfully across projects. Another thing is like moving things leftwards. That last bullet point, do it early and do it often, but it's never too late to threat model. Let's say something has been released, it's out there in production. Nothing wrong with doing a retrospective review and threat model on that to pick up things that may have laden over time. And I guess the second tip I have discovered over my time is finding issues is pretty easy. Fixing issues is the hard bit. So that all comes down to prioritization of precious developer cycles and trying to make impact. That's a real asymmetry with security, just like the asymmetry of an attacker only having to find a few holes and the defender needing to plug them all. I'm going to pause for a moment because I want this to be as interactive as possible. Any questions or comments so far? So there's three main takeaways I want to get across in this presentation. And one of those will be just having a look here. So yeah, first one is going to be like the four general questions behind how to threat model. And we'll use Adam Shostak's four-question frame. Adam's been a thought leader in threat modeling since 2002, 2003. He actually basically invented the discipline, wrote the book. He was at Microsoft as a program manager at the time. The second of our takeaways is the approach. This is the repeatable and consistent approach, and we'll be using something called stride per element, and we'll explain what stride is and what we mean by applying that on a per element basis in a few slides' times. And the third of the takeaways will be then based on using this stride per element repeatable approach across a software design to then form a list of threats and then propose mitigations and then risk rank those, and then determine if we've done a good job and how do we validate that those controls stay in place. And that's something we do through a security regression testing framework. So that's really the main things that I'm going to cover here. Okay, so we've talked about basically what threat modeling is. We know now that it's a design time activity that we enable developers to be able to perform, and it means that they can use a repeatable process to identify issues early on in the development lifecycle. So how do we perform this? This is where that Adam Shostak 4-question frame comes into play. Very basic feedback loop. So we model what we're working on, and modeling it can be formal or it can be informal. It can be anything from a very detailed data flow diagram that's been decomposed n layers deep, or it can be as informal as just a drawing on a chalkboard and then assessing that. And it comes down to, and it's better to start immature and get more mature as designs solidify. And again, it's better starting early and starting on something incomplete and getting an early indication as to potential things that would be non-starters because it might be too much risk involved. So it's very much an iterable and repeatable type of process. So we start with a model, and by using that model and this consistent approach, we're able to come up with a list of threats that we can analyze. Then we can come up with controls to mitigate those threats, and then we validate whether those controls are effective. And we can keep on doing that to a point of getting to an appropriate risk posture for a given application or service, preferably before it's deployed. Okay, so what we'll be doing is we'll visualize our system like an attacker would. We'll then brainstorm attacks like an attacker would, and then we'll create mitigations like an engineer would, because we want the rigor and robustness of those controls. Okay, just to check, is everyone seeing a slide showing some concepts titled data flow diagrams and trust boundaries?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm not going to introduce too many formal things in this presentation, and this is probably as formal as it really gets, and this is the types of widgets that we use in threat modeling. There's only 5 or so widgets that we commonly use, and this is so that we've got again a consistent way to be able to model a service or a system. So data flow diagrams are pretty well understood by software developers. Again, we don't want to put too much friction in the way of developers. So if a developer is using sequence diagrams, or if they're using logical architecture diagrams or block diagrams or something, then we would go with that as an alternative, because we want developers to threat model using the least friction possible. Otherwise, we've instantly got a barrier where we may not be getting what we need in order to be able to get the right security outcomes. But a data flow diagram is really the best way for us to be able to do this. And I'll show you an example in the next slide of what an example web-based data flow diagram might look like. Then we use STRIDE, and STRIDE it's basically just an acronym, 6-letter acronym. Each of those 6 letters is a different type of threat category. We'll enumerate that acronym in a moment, and then by being able to apply STRIDE against each of the data flows across a trust boundary, which we'll also talk about in a moment, we then generate that list of threats, and then we evaluate those threats and come up with mitigations. And that's all threat modeling is at that 40,000-foot view.
So we have a question from Farhan. So Farhan, please unmute yourself.
Sure, thank you. Craig, interesting definition though. I want to understand how can you relate threat modeling into the broader umbrella of risk assessment? Because what I see, it's kind of relate with the risk assessment. That's what we do. But what exactly? How can you fit it? Is it an application within risk assessment to identify controls? We do threat modeling, or how it can fit together?
Yeah, great question. So threats and risks are definitely related. A threat may or may not be realized, like a building catching fire, for example. Risks are when we're starting to look at the likelihoods and the impacts behind something occurring, and then we come up with a risk rating. So what we do in this approach is we start by using threat modeling to come up with a list of threats. At that point, they aren't rated or prioritized. We come up with likely controls for the threats. Then we work out, is it worth the cost benefit analysis? Is it mitigating enough of what that threat is, and how much cost is it going to come? And then at that point, we can then start looking at risk. We can look at the inherent risk, which is the risk without putting planned controls in place. Then we can look at the residual risk. Once we put those controls in place, what's still remaining? Because it's pretty hard to get risk down to zero. Some work colleagues say like the best network security control is a pair of wire cutters, for example. And obviously we know that we won't have a running business if we use that as a control. So it's all about balancing risk. But in probably about 3/4 of the way through, I'll start to introduce risk matrices to be able to identify controls and work out whether they're suitable or not for a given threat. But great question. So there's definitely a relationship between the two. Any other questions before we move on? All right, so I've got a example data flow diagram here, and I found an open source GitHub project where you can actually get this same data flow diagram from. It's in a draw.io format, which is also an open source diagramming tool, and you can load that up in there if ever any of you want to use these examples yourself and build on top of them. So we've got I won't go into too much depth in terms of all of the data flows here, but we're using the threat modeling stencils. So we've got some external entities, we've got like customers, we've got customer service operators and administrative users. Can you see my mouse waving around as I do that?
Yes.
Great. Okay, fantastic. So I'll talk through bottom up with the main flows because I want to talk about that top flow the most and have that in the forefront of your mind. So we've got some administrative users. They go through a admin web portal and they're able to make changes to the identity store. They're able to administer that, add identity users, manipulate the product API so that then we've got customers. They're able to go through a shopping website, log in, go through a login verification step, which queries the underlying identity store, and then they can get a token, an authentication token, authorization token, pass that through as they're making internal product API calls, which is invisible to the customer, but that's happening behind the scenes, so that they can populate a shopping cart based on goods they want to purchase. So it's a fairly common type of flow. That same customer is able to update customer profile type of information, demographics and such. And they're also able to register themselves as well, register like shipping addresses, payment providers and such. So there's also a customer service operator role, and they're able to act on behalf of the customer. So they're able to go through a request proxying layer and basically be an anonymized act on behalf of customer so that they can troubleshoot customer issues. So this is let's say that this is a hypothetical shopping experience that the developers are coming up with, and the developers have come up with a data flow diagram to show these main flows. We won't have time in the next 30 odd minutes to threat model the whole thing. We'll just come up with 1 or 2 threats just to show you how threat modeling works based on the stride per element approach. So given this type of data flow diagram, the first thing we do, actually I'm going to take a step back for a moment, is we want to think about who are the external interactors. So we know that there's customers, customer service operators, and administrative users. There's potentially some machine interactors as well. There might be some, agents that are collecting logs and things. They haven't been diagrammed here, but again, as we decompose and go into more depth, we would get to that next level of detail as well. External interactors can be internal humans or systems, or external users or systems. They are just entities that interact with this service being created. We've also got data stores, and we can see those through the upper and lower horizontal lines. That's the stencil for data stores when it comes to data flow diagrams. So we've got the product API to help to build the catalog, the identity store, and an administrative identity store for administrative identities. And then we've got the processes. So we've got like a login process, a login verification step, registration process steps, etc. So in order to be able to perform stride by element. And this won't maybe mean anything to you just yet, but I'll further cement the concept. To perform stride per element, we apply stride across any data flow that traverses a trust boundary. So we need to now determine what our trust boundaries are. And what a trust boundary is it's a gradient level of difference in trust between two interacting components. Like a common example might be an unauthenticated customer hitting the customer website and then being challenged to authenticate themselves. So we've got an untrusted user, we don't know who they are at this point, and we've got a semi-trusted customer website that might be under our control. So there's a trust boundary there. As we go in further, we can come up with additional trust boundaries. For example, the login verification step, that is some programming logic that is working on a inbound customer request, looking at maybe the user credentials and passing that over to the identity store to validate is this a recognized user with the correct credentials or not. So the identity user store may not trust that login verification step because that login verification step is working with unvalidated, untrusted, externally provided data from a unauthenticated customer at this point, because we still don't know whether they are the real customer because we haven't fully finished that authentication process. So that might be an internal trust boundary between some business or application logic and some back-end data stores. We could go even further when it comes to trust boundaries. Let's say, let's say this admin web UI itself for the internal administrative users. That admin web UI has some logging agents installed on it so that we can inspect audit logs looking for suspicious activity. That logging agent might have some code that runs in kernel space because it's needing to hook into the underlying event subsystem of that operating system. So the logging agent itself, there might be a trust boundary between parts of that logging agent and the stuff that's running in kernel space. So that user land to kernel system call, that would be a trust boundary. So you can keep going deeper and deeper. And one natural question that comes up is, how do you know when you've gone deep enough when it comes to threat modeling? And there's no real scientific answer on that. It comes down to, have you decomposed the overall system enough that you're not coming up with any additional useful threats? So it's an iterative approach till you get to a point of diminishing returns. I'm going to pause for a moment before we look at the trust boundaries. Any questions so far? If there are, Hong, just do what you did last time and jump in, because I'm not looking at the chat at the same time. So awesome, thank you. What I've done here is I've formed trust boundaries. This was my work on top of that GitHub project. So basically, if any of you want to do this yourself, I've got the links to the underlying threat model diagram that's open sourced. And the beautiful thing about draw.io, which is completely open source, is it's also got threat modeling stencils that you can import into draw.io and just have these widgets to add to the diagrams. So I formed trust boundaries between those data flows that traverse between components of different trust levels. So external customers to websites, internal flows as well, like the login verification not being trusted by the underlying identity store because it's working with untrusted input. So now that we've got these trust boundaries formed between these data flows, that's when we can apply stride. So I shall jump over, and this is where things get interesting and useful. So stride, as I mentioned, is a 6-letter acronym for 6 different types of threat categories. This also came out of Microsoft in the 2002-2003 timeframe as part of the security development lifecycle from that trustworthy computing mandate from Bill Gates. So if you have a look here, we've got 6 threat categories. So spoofing would be pretending to be someone other than yourself. Like I might be pretending to be Ron as opposed to myself. So that would be a type of threat. Tampering is modifying data in a malicious type of way. So one example there might be the shopping cart total amount might be $403. If I'm able to tamper with that and get away with it and make it $43 instead of $403, then that might be an example of tampering. Repudiation, that is being able to get away with lying about having performed or not performed an action. So a common example might be if there's a lack of audit logs being generated, an attacker might be able to claim that they didn't perform an action. So if I add something to my shopping cart and hit purchase, but somehow subvert the payment processing step and get those goods shipped to me, and there's no audit trails of my activity, it's going to be much harder for the e-commerce provider to prove that I didn't pay for those goods. These are that's a superficial example. Of course, there's other ways, like with bank statements and things, but you sort of get the point where it's being able to claim that you did or didn't perform something because the server side isn't storing enough evidence to counterclaim. The I in Stride is information disclosure, and that can be anything from verbose error messages, giving away partial information on the internal workings of a solution, or it could be much broader than that, like side channel attacks you might see at the hardware level. There's a whole range of information disclosure types of issues that can come about. Denial of service, that might be a way to be able to impact the availability or response time of a system. And things like request throttling, using exponential backoff can be a really good way to be able to mitigate denial of service types of attacks. Or you might have something where there's a regular expression performing input validation, but the regular expressions aren't well written, and then there could be a CPU exhaustion attack where an attacker is then able to put in a string that the regular expression itself ends up having an exponential CPU time to be able to solve for. The last one in Stride is elevation of privilege, the E in Stride. And the elevation of privilege means that as an authorized user, Craig, I might be able to trick the system into performing more privileges, which is known as vertical privilege escalation. So say if Ron's an admin and Craig is just a general user, if I'm able to log in myself as Craig, but call functions that aren't doing proper validation that only Ron should be able to do, then I've done horizontal privilege escalation. Then there's also vertical that was vertical privilege escalation. Then there's horizontal privilege escalation where, let's say Matt and Craig are the same type of user class. I, Craig, log in, and then I pretend to have access to Matt's resources and make changes to those. Again, if the authorization model isn't doing proper validation, then we've got horizontal privilege escalation. So what we've got here is 6 types of threat categories, which are giving pretty good coverage across a whole range of security types of situations. I'm going to pause for a moment. Can anyone think of a type of security attack that you don't think is covered by Stride?
Phishing?
Yeah, phishing. That's a good call out. So, and it depends what phishing brings to the table. So phishing might be a way for a user to accidentally give up their credentials, and that might then lead to a spoofing attack. So yeah, so phishing might become the attack vector. What's that one, sorry?
Ransomware attack?
Ransomware. So let's say if I'm tricked into installing an illegitimate application that looks legit, and it's got some payload such as encrypting all of my files, and suddenly I'm being subverted for money, a ransomware attack, that one could actually be considered as tampering because it's making changes to the integrity of my system, or potentially denial of service as well, because now I've got an availability attack against my files. So yeah, I've actually found Stride to be pretty robust. It's high enough level that you can marry a lot of real world situations into it.
I can think of one. Who is being attacked?
Yeah.
Recently, I forgot the name of the company, but their headquarters was attacked, and quietly a bug was inserted into installation software, which was auto-installed into their customer base. Can't remember the name.
You're thinking of SolarWinds?
SolarWinds, that's the one.
Yeah. They are 20 minutes away from where I work. They're awesome base as well.
But the thing is, Stride doesn't apply if you don't know who the victim is. That is.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's a good call out. So you want to know who the attacker is, what the attacker motivations are, and who the victim would be as well. And there are also steps when it comes to overall threat modeling. So we're focusing on the threat and mitigation part, but there is a pretext to that, and that is the attacker and the attacker motivations. So absolutely good call out. And supply chain risks become very, very interesting with that type of thing. All right. So I'm bringing up that data flow diagram again with the trust boundaries that we inserted as an overlay. And then we've just learned about what Stride is, those 6 threat categories. So this is where we can apply Stride per element. And basically for any data flow traversing one of these dotted red trust boundaries, we would apply Stride across that data flow. So if we take, I'm looking at an example here. So if we take the customer logging into the customer website and traversing that trust boundary, we could say, could the customer be spoofing their identity? I mean, absolutely. Until they've logged in, they are anonymous. So let's say Craig is logging in. Craig's giving up a username and a password, and it'd be nice if it was a SSO or MFA challenge as well as part of that. But let's say it's just a username and password, and Craig pretends to be Zahir. So that is a spoofing threat. We aren't focused on controls yet, but we've absolutely got a spoofing threat. Have we got a tampering threat? When it comes to Craig trying to log into the customer website, I mean, yes. I mean, Craig is giving up a username and password as part of a web form field. There is a tampering threat there. If there's a middle person on the wire, they could tamper with that flow and modify that information. So we're not talking about controls at this point, such as say TLS, HTTPS on the wire, but there's absolutely a threat there. Repudiation, maybe Craig's not Craig. Maybe if there's no logging by the customer website, Craig could claim that he never tried to log into that website, so might be able to repudiate that action. So yes, there's a repudiation threat here as well. Information disclosure. Yep, perhaps the customer website is giving up its HTTP header responses. It might be giving up its operating system version or version of web server or application server and various things. Denial of service, yeah, perhaps Craig could send too many half-open requests to the website, such as like a slow HTTP, slow LoRa style of attack or something else, and cause a DOS issue against the website. Elevation of privilege, yes. I mean, perhaps Craig is trying to log into a web admin panel of that website and become an administrative user as opposed to a normal shopping user for this website. So Stride, we apply across each of these trust boundaries being traversed. So, and that's the part that becomes, I guess, the repeatable approach. So we've got a model. We've got that science and the art to work out where the trust boundaries are, what the data flows are, and then we've got that engineering rigor of applying this Stride per element approach to come up with a list of threats. So again, we won't have time to cover more than, we'll probably just look at one main threat here to show you how this works in action. I want to sort of finish an end-to-end example so that you can walk away and say that you've come up with a threat against a web application using a repeatable process. So one threat here, if we look at this threat description, is the threat might be a vulnerable authentication library or authorization library. And by having a vulnerable authn or authz library, that might lead to an attacker getting access to that underlying identity store. So I'm going to rewind to this slide. So we've got this customer traversing a trust boundary to get to the website. That website is then querying a backend system to verify the login details of the customer. So we're actually traversing 3 trust boundaries in this flow. There is absolutely a threat here for spoofing, where we try and get an authentication bypass, and we might have that occur because if it's a SAML-based authn, authz type of service, and we're using a third-party SAML library that is vulnerable, hasn't been patched, that could lead to the customer getting broader access to the underlying identity store. That could actually lead to a data breach. Maybe that all of the contents of that identity store get leaked and put onto Pastebin or a underground hacking forum or something else. So that's the threat we'll evaluate. So we've come up with a threat description here, which is the vulnerable third-party library that does the authn, authz SAML checks, hasn't been patched, and allows broader access to that identity store. Then we look at the business impact. So we could potentially have a broader customer privacy breach. We're breaking customer trust. And there could also be some bad optics out there too, like additional media attention, regulatory attention as well. Because we've got this attacker goal, and Ron called out earlier with SolarWinds as an example, we need to think about who the victim is and what the attacker motivations are. So we do bring that up in the threat modeling so that we are tying back to attacker goals and business impacts. So what's also important here is the type of risk category. So the stride threats, those 6 different types of threats, we then put those into a risk category. So an earlier question around how do threats correspond to risks, we'll get to that in a moment because we're starting to form risk categories, and then we'll do some risk evaluation. So we've got spoofing and information disclosure risks with this type of threat scenario. And as you see here, the actual controls or mitigations and how do we validate that those controls are in place and effective, we won't cover that just yet. We'll cover that in a moment. What we want to do is we don't want to get locked, and again, taking this back to software builders, we don't want to get that analysis paralysis. We don't want to get locked into solutioning because that can be a rabbit hole. We actually want to just go and identify all of the threats. Then we'll get into mitigations as another exercise. So so as opposed to getting blocked into solutioning mode, let's continue and let's do some risk scoring. So because we haven't actually come up with controls yet, we're looking at the inherent risk. So we've got a threat. So we've got that vulnerable third-party SAML library, and then we do some risk analysis. Without any other controls in place, what's the likelihood of this attack vector being used to ultimately come up with this data breach of the underlying identity store? I've gone with medium. It really does depend on the vulnerability, of course, but hypothetically, let's say there's somewhat difficult to exploit types of vulnerabilities that haven't been patched. So we've got a medium likelihood. The impact is going to be high. Maybe it's extreme. It depends on your risk matrix. What we're using here is a 3x3 risk matrix with likelihood values of low, medium, and high, impact values of low, medium, and high as well. And then the intersections of those means you can come up with overall risks of anywhere from informational through to critical. Another trade tip I would say is when using risk matrices, 3x3s work a lot better than 5x5s. It becomes easier to prioritize when you've got a list of risks that need remediation as well. Otherwise, I find people spend too much time deliberating between, if you've got 5 values by 5 values, those values between 3 and 5 is a lot more deliberation. So 3x3, we're able to make more progress. So anyway, we've got a medium likelihood, a high impact. I'm just going to check my work. High impact. Yep, that gives us an overall high risk rating. Did someone have a question? All right. I'll keep going. We don't have all that many more slides left. I've got a few that are appendix related. So now that we've come up with a high risk rating, let's say we've got a business decision of all high risks need to be mitigated before we launch this service. So we need to put mitigations in place. We need to choose our controls now. So if you remember those 4 questions from Adam Shostak, I'm going to rewind just a moment to show those 4 questions. We've got, what are we working on? So we've come up with a data flow diagram. What could go wrong? That is forming the trust boundaries, applying stride per element, and coming up with a list of threats. The third question is, what are we going to do about it? That is choosing those controls and then doing a residual risk rating based on those controls. And after we've done that, we'll get to that last question of validating those controls. In other words, did we do a good enough job? So that third question, what are we going to do about it? So therefore, we need to come up with some controls in place to limit the impact of a vulnerable third-party package doing SAML, auth NLC, assertion validation. Some tips in terms of coming up with mitigations or controls. So basically, when it comes to risk, we can avoid risk, we can mitigate it, we can transfer it, or we can accept it. We don't want to accept a high risk here. Maybe there's ways to transfer it by basically, outsourcing that whole verification business process. In this case, we won't use that in the hypothetical example. We could mitigate the risk by patching that, but just patching it alone means what's stopping another upstream vulnerability in that third-party dependency from creeping in and biting us. So we should do multiple things to mitigate this by having multiple mitigations, and some of those might be preventative, some of those might be detective, and some of those might be directive, such as like 2-person code review and things like that. We get much more defense in depth by having a variance of controls. So let's do that. So now we're filling in those last 3 columns for this threat. We've got that list of threats in the threat model, and we've got one threat called out, which is spoofing and information disclosure leading to that attacker goal of a data breach. Let's come up with some mitigations for that threat. So we could have a regression testing framework to actually validate that there are no authentication or authorization bypasses to get to that identity store. So let's say there is a vulnerable SAML assertion library. We've got some additional defenses in place. We could actually have a better vetted library that's performing the token validation itself. I've got a typo. I should have said SAML instead of JWT here, given that we've got a SAML example. So a much more well-vetted library. And that could come to the point of automated reasoning. Maybe it's model checking. Maybe it's like a stat solver of some sort, but more rigor in terms of the library, given that it's such an important library doing authentication, authorization decisions, putting more scrutiny on that. We could have a directive control, such as 2-person code review, and ensuring that any changes to that critical third-party library very well understood and validated. So it's not just one person having a bad day and something being accidentally or maliciously slipped in. And then having monitoring and alarming on failed login attempts. So often, if there is a vulnerability, it's rare for someone to be able to exploit that in one single go, first up, and getting everything right. Normally there's some trial and error there. So if we've got a detective control where we're looking at those errors, that's a pretty strong indicator that we've got a bad actor, and we can quickly respond. Maybe we call a kill switch on that user and lock them out for some time. Maybe we put them into a tar pit to slow them down. A variety of types of responses to a detective control there could make sense. So what we've got here is multiple types of mitigations, and we've got that variance in mitigations between detective, preventative, and directive. Then in a threat model, we need to call out what those mitigation statuses are. I mean, it's great to come up with mitigations, but if they haven't been implemented, then like that earlier comment I made, it's easy to find issues, but it's much harder to fix and resolve issues. So it's important that we resolve these issues by putting these controls in place. So we should be tracking the controls to completion. And then we should validate that those controls are in place and effective. And that means additional checks. It might be pen testing, bug bounties, model checkers, like I mentioned, around like, vetting a relied upon library. So I'm going to pause for a moment. I called out decomposition earlier. Now that we've actually come up with these controls, and let's say we've been implementing these controls, do you think we're done from a threat modeling perspective? What else could go wrong now that we've introduced those controls?
The control itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think if it may go to the like nested levels,
absolutely.
Chat model within a chat model within a chat model of those controls, for example.
Yeah, great call out. So we need to further decompose. We've put controls in place. We should go to that next level now. We should threat model and same process. So we add those controls to that data flow diagram, introduce the trust boundaries for those controls, and apply stride on any data flows that traverse those trust boundaries for those controls. So like let's take one of these controls. Let's say it is the vetted library. Let's try another one. Let's try the monitoring and alarming. Let's say that monitoring and alarming needs an agent to be able to do that additional instrumentation and inspection, and that agent needs kernel level access. That's a potential risk, because if that agent that's got kernel level access gets compromised, suddenly we can have a full machine compromise, and if that agent's across the whole fleet, suddenly we've got a whole fleet compromise. So yes, we should be performing threat modeling in a layer by layer approach by decomposing the solution. So before we get to that though, so we've now got some controls in place, and let's now look at the threat and the likelihood. So we've still got the same threat. Is there any difference in the likelihood? So we've added some controls. Yes, that's probably reduced the likelihood that the attacker will be successful. We've got some detect and response. We've got some better vetting of the library itself. Let's say we've gone and patched the library as well. What about the impact? We haven't actually changed the impact. We've still got a high impact, because if an attacker is able to realize this threat, even though the likelihood is reduced, the impact is the same. So now we've gone from a high risk, because we had a medium likelihood and a high impact, to a low likelihood. A low likelihood and a high impact. So we're still at a medium risk. So we've gone from a high risk to a medium risk. Let's say we decide we aren't comfortable with medium risks making it into production. That means we have to go further and do some more work around our controls. So one thing that we could do here, more work, is let's say we want to put that SAML assertion library, that third-party library, we could put that into its own container and have it make a decision, and based on its decision, that might then go to a message queue. That way we no longer have direct access from that SAML assertion validation library through to that underlying identity store. We can put a layer of abstraction in place there, and therefore if that third-party package becomes vulnerable again, it's going to have much less impact. At that point, we've actually reduced the impact of that threat, and we might be then getting to a low or an informational level risk. All right, so yeah, really that last question when it comes to threat modeling, did we do a good enough job? So we want to have that variance in controls. We want to, probably get, brainstorm for additional threats, and we do that by getting a second set of eyes, but also decomposing and iterating, like that previous participant mentioned. Like the controls themselves can introduce threats, so we need to in turn look at those as well. And then by that stage, whilst there's no absolute guarantees of completeness, and a threat model is never done until that service has been properly decommissioned, there's always risk with a running service. We've actually shifted leftwards and proactively come up with threats, controls, risk rated those, and we're in a much better spot. So as we start to wrap up, I've got a summary in terms of the asymmetry between a defender and an attacker, and I'll leave it for you as a reading exercise, but the biggest call out here is the defender typically needs to fix all of the issues, whereas an attacker only needs to find one or a couple in order to be able to get some level of access. And this is why threat modeling is so key. So what we've now got is a repeatable approach to be able to reason about threats and come up with controls. All right, real quickly, there's a few extensions to threat modeling. Threat trees and attack trees. Bruce and I did some great work on attack trees. It was originally based on, like Ron called out the Cold War, like approaches like fault tree analysis. They've been used for decades and decades. So threat and attack trees is an extension of that type of approach. A colleague of mine, Ian Green, did some great work around extreme cyber scenario planning, where we take the attacker motivation, let's say it's steal a car, and we then go down and decompose what does it mean to steal a car. Maybe they can need to unlock a door and start the engine. We can have these and or types of tree approaches. What does it take to unlock the door? You can smash the window or pick the lock, and that's an or, one or the other. You don't need to do both. What do you need to do to start the engine? Either hotwire or stick a screwdriver into the ignition and get to the coil. So basically, look at, we know it's an and at the top. We've got for these two conditions, then it's an or at the bottom. So you can join those things. You can smash a window and then hotwire, or maybe you just pick the lock and stick a screwdriver in the ignition. That's basic attack tree analysis. But the extension that Ian Green put on this is going that little bit further. Determine what type of controls are in place, and then rate those controls based on their effectiveness when it comes to like the potential to mitigate the threat, the cost of the control, so you get that cost benefit analysis, and then the status, like is the control in place or is it not in place? Is it only partially effective? So like bulletproof glass, that's very preventative, but it's extremely expensive. A Sidewinder lock, very cheap and mostly effective. So it's that type of analysis visually that also helps like reason further about, are we getting good bang for buck when it comes to the controls to mitigate those threats. That's all the content I've got. Some really good resources if you're interested in this type of thing. We've got a Adam Shostak's book, that's like the Bible for threat modeling. Ross Anderson is now up to the 3rd edition of the security engineering book. That is a fantastic read. And OWASP itself, OWASP actually came up with the 2021 top 10 list. That's in draft format, hot off the press, just in time for the 20-year anniversary. And the person who runs OWASP, it's a open web application security project. It's mostly Creative Commons material and open source tools along the way. The person that runs that is ex-RMIT as well, Andrew Vanderstock. So that's everything I've got. I can stick around for a few minutes. So yeah, I'm happy to open up the floor.
Thank you, Craig. That was really very good presentation, and I think you give us a very nice, very systematic way how to do the threat modeling and mitigation. Just a question that related to CVSS vulnerabilities. Do you use those vulnerability scores the way they are given in the standards for the doing the modeling as well, or they don't come into equation?
Gotcha. Yep, good question. So CVSS, Common Vulnerability Scoring approach, that is a really good mechanism. I would say a lot of companies out there use that. I've used it at a number of organizations, and yes, we do use CVSS for a variety of things. The other good thing about CVSS, especially like version 3 and more recently, I think 3.1, it's got ways to be able to have scoring modifiers like temporal scores, environmental scores and things, so it's not too rigid. Back in the day, like we talk about Stride here, Stride has stood the test of time. When Microsoft come up with Stride, they also came up with a scoring rubric called DREAD, which is things like, damage, the DREAD, that's 5, DREAD, that's a 5-letter acronym for being able to measure overall risk. Unfortunately, it was too rigid, and yeah, people don't use DREAD. It's very rare to see anyone using DREAD. CVSS has really filled that void to come up with an adaptable type of risk scoring methodology. So yeah, good call out. Have you had any experience yourself with CVSS?
Yeah, we have looked at it in our research, and particularly developing a few variants of it as well, particularly in the IoT devices, because that's a sort of a different ball game, and particularly in the context where the IoT device is working, how that can be taken into consideration while modeling the vulnerabilities. So we kind of have looked at that. So again, my question next was the IoT related systems. So do you use the same approach as well, modeling the threat as well, if that's valid?
Yep.
Some different
exactly. Yeah, so threat modeling, you don't have to just use on software services. It works equally well for hardware, things outside of IT as a whole. You can use that overall approach. Because if I go back to the, sorry, I'm gonna go back to this diagram. I've seen this done with like a service station, for example, where you've got petroleum pumps, you know, you've got a cash register, you've got these types of assets, and you know, potential damaging threats. Like someone might get to a point of being able to blow up a petrol pump and cause impact. So there's safety concerns. There's the, you know, concerns about stealing money, taking people hostage, all sorts of things. Threat modeling is a great approach. Again, repeatable and consistent and adaptable as well. So you don't have to just use it in the IT domain.
Thank you very much, Greg.
We have another question from Vince and then Juha.
No, thanks for the great talk. My question relates to, I've been at a conference yesterday and today. I've popped out to listen to your talk, and when I saw your little trust boundaries, would you say that most of those trust boundaries are API calls? Because I'm at API days.
Gotcha. Yep. Okay. Oh, thanks for stopping in from your conference. I wasn't sure if it was going to be the SpaceX launch that you were watching instead.
No, that's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Like API endpoints, it can be web-based endpoints. It can be even internal system calls on the same host, on the same operating system. It could be inter-process. So all of those things are two communicating parties with a different level of trust between them.
Because the keynote this morning, you reminded me of it because you talked about cars and getting into unlocking and locking the doors. The lady who gave the talk, Alyssa Knight, showed she hacked the police car's network to be able to unlock and lock the doors of the car. So that, could you put that as a third option? Unlocking and locking using the API calls to the, and they use the bowler attack on it. So the getting the authentication, mirroring it and connecting that way. So she's it was a great talk, and she's got an interesting YouTube channel that has all the videos of her hacking these different things. The last 2 years she's been hacking healthcare services. So because that's topical at the moment. But yeah, that's a big trust boundary, the healthcare network, because it provides so much data and access to healthcare records. So thanks for the talk.
Absolutely.
It's great to hear a talk that sort of looks at it in a systematic way.
Yeah, cool. And definitely, like, it's about identifying what the attack surface is, and then part of this is attack surface reduction by systemically going through it. And there's a really good talk, Andy Greenfeld, I think, from a journalist put it together. I think it was the if I'm remembering correctly, I think it was a Jeep Cherokee that people were able to take over. So when it comes to
I've seen that talk. It's fantastic. Through the radio system, through the stereo system in it.
Yep.
And every car that had that stereo system, which were all upmarket cars, were susceptible to the attack. They get into the bus and then control the car that way. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, exactly.
Juha?
Yes, thank you, Wang. And thank you, Craig, for the nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. So my question is related to smart contracts and decentralized applications. So as opposed to traditional software development, smart contracts are permanent. Once you deploy them, you cannot change them. And also they are public. So I was wondering if the traditional threat modeling and the methodologies still are applied to blockchain applications, or we need to have some kind of improvement.
Yep. Yeah, great question. I think with like smart contracts, if you look at the network as a whole, like all of the parties that are interacting, so you've got someone making the assertion, someone validating that assertion, those contracts being passed in ownership between parties. But come out with a data flow diagram showing that, and then thinking about the assets. Like one of those assets is the underlying algorithms of the smart contract itself. Maybe that smart contract program has untrusted third-party codes. There might be a supply chain attack that's available there as well. There could be some other parts of the code that have bugs. There might be some edge cases. So I think you could quite successfully come up with a threat model and apply Stride against a smart contract network. That would be fun to see. So if you end up doing that, let me know and reach out. I'd like to see what you come up with.
Okay, thank you.
I think we are nearly the end here. I just to say a great thanks, Craig. You have done a great job. I'm really looking forward to work with you, to work with the members of the CSRI Center, right? And looking forward to collaboration with you as an ex-RMIT, and is really looking forward to try to see how we can engage you with the center, because there's a lot of interest. I can see the comments here. They really loved it. I just summarized it. They really loved it, and they really appreciate your talk. It's really great. I'm really proud of you, man, and as an ex-RMIT one. And thank you again. And I will let Hong probably say the last words.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you, Craig, for staying up late. And so I think it's like 9 p.m. or more in Texas. So thanks a lot, and hope to have the opportunity to work with you more in the future.
Sounds great. And thanks for the opportunity. Really appreciate being able to present to you folks and catch up again, and some really good old friends there. So looking forward to seeing some of you in person once the international borders open up, because my first visit is a barber in Geelong that is a promise to a friend. I'm not allowed to shave until we have that barber visit together. So,
so hopefully it will be soon, not next year, right?
I could look like Ned Kelly the way things are going.
They won't let you in Australia, right? Maybe. It's great, man. I have to say, really very happy. Looking forward to work with you, Craig, and we keep in touch, right? Okay, guys.
That's great.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, everybody. See you next time. See you next talk. There is another talk. I think, Hong, can you say about the next talk from? It's a panel, right?
It's a panel discussion. I think it's in 23rd of September, so it will be very soon. So hope to see all of you guys there. Yeah. So thank you, Craig, and thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. I'll have Ned Kelly there as well.
Bye-bye. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.